Let's bring in NBC's Stan DeLuce at the Pentagon, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder, and the founding director of the National Center for Preparedness at Columbia University, who has made multiple trips to Ukraine, Dr. Erwin Redlener. Dan, let me start with you. So you have what seems to be a dispute between Zelensky and Poland and the United States, who believe they have at least a preliminary assessment. What do you make of that, and what might it mean when we're told that shortly we may have some conclusive decision here about what actually happened?
That's right. I think we've gone from a very anxious moment yesterday when there seemed to be the ability that Russia had launched a missile or a missile attack on Poland, and now we're in a more awkward moment where among allies, among friends, there's a disagreement here. But from the rest of NATO, from the NATO Secretary General, from you just heard the Defense Secretary, the Polish President, they all are saying it looks like at the moment that it was this errant, mistaken Ukrainian air defense projectile. And so they're going to wait for the investigation to look at all that. But it was also, they were very careful in their language. They weren't criticizing Ukraine, obviously. And Defense Secretary Austin was making a point saying, you know, really, ultimately, Russia does bear responsibility for launching this invasion in the first place and for firing, you know, waves of missiles at Ukraine, and then Ukraine has to defend itself. And I think there are some military analysts who will say it's sort of it's really a surprise in a way that this hasn't happened before, given the amount of weapons flying through the air. But yes, an awkward moment right now with Ukraine still maintaining that they don't think it's their missile. But there was still a kind of a ringing endorsement of continued support for Ukraine. Austin and General Milley saying that there would be no let-up. The U.S. and all of its allies had resolve and determination to provide aid to Ukraine as long as it takes. And you had some really colorful remarks by General Milley where he was saying, you know, Russia's military is hurting badly, and they've failed at every moment, at every objective. They've failed, and they're now really on the back foot.
There were, Ambassador, many very intense and tense moments yesterday. Many of the world leaders were at the G20 in Bali. They immediately were in conversation. We know NATO immediately was activated. They have been in conversation. But a lot of the talk today at this press conference was about whether or not this could lead to some sort of political solution, whether or not there was essentially an off-ramp. And when you have these concerns that, OK, this time it was potentially a missile defense system, but there could be another missile that goes awry. There could be more destruction. At the beginning of this war, there were concerns, as you well know, that perhaps could an errant missile hit a nuclear power plant. Does this move that pressure forward? Does it move the ball forward in the possibility of some sort of negotiated settlement, or at least sitting down to talks?
Yeah, I really don't think so. I think, I think the reaction yesterday was a little over the top everywhere. I think we needed to establish the facts and know the facts. Things like this happen in war, and we don't want to start a major escalation without knowing exactly what has happened and without making a very deliberate decision that that is the best course of action. So I think we're now in the stage of finalizing the fact gathering, and I see NATO, I see the system as a whole, including the U.S. government, trying to go through the motions that are necessary to establish the facts and then move on. While perhaps outside there was a lot of churn. At the same time, this does remind everyone that accidents do happen in war, that things go wrong, that nothing goes according to plan, that there is this fog of war. And I hope that President Biden and officials in Bali use the opportunity to remind some of those who have been either on the sidelines or, like China, supportive of President Putin, to remind them that their continued support and their unwillingness to stand up against Russia for its illegal aggression against Ukraine is part of what causes this problem. We're not going to resolve this issue through negotiations by having the Ukrainians throw up their hands and say, good, you can take 20% of our territory and reward a war of aggression. The only way you're going to resolve this confrontation is for the Russians to reverse what they did, not only just since February, but frankly, since 2014, and is take their forces and move them back to Russia and outside of Russia's territory. It's that ultimately caused this conflict. And it is that ultimately caused the missile, whether Ukrainian or, as it looks like, or even Russian, to fall on Polish territory.
But knowing Vladimir Putin, do you think that's a realistic expectation, Ambassador?
No, I don't. And that's why I think the military effort needs to continue. And I listened very carefully to what General Milley had to say, and I listened very carefully to what Secretary Austin had to say, both of whom indicated that we would do whatever it is necessary for the Ukrainians to continue to advance militarily. They have, for the last 6 months, been pushing the Russians steadily away from Ukrainian territory, including the major victory over Kherson just this week. And as a result, the Russians are suffering gravely. Dan is rightly pointing out that the chairman made very clear that Russia's military is on its back. So let's continue to support the Ukrainians with everything they need to defend their cities against these brutal missile attacks and to be able to retake the territory that is rightfully theirs. That's how you end this war. I don't think you're going to end it by having Ukraine surrender or by convincing Vladimir Putin to engage in a negotiation that he's unlikely to enter into.
Dr. Redlener, brutal is right, and maybe even that's an understatement. What we have seen just in one day yesterday, what precipitated the use of the air defense systems was something like 90 missiles that were aimed at Ukraine from Russia. We already knew that there were devastating humanitarian conditions. We heard just now from General Milley. He talked about his own concerns about hospitals being partially operational, about the elderly being exposed to the elements, entering into the winter months. You've been there. You've worked there in a humanitarian capacity. Tell me what your concerns are. What even went through your mind when you saw the number of missiles and heard of the destruction that was happening yesterday, compounding what we've already seen in Ukraine?
Yeah, so Chris, thanks for this opportunity. Well, the problem is that while political and military gains are absolutely happening, that's fantastic. However, there's a parallel track of civilian suffering that is unescapable. You know, when we were there in October, on October 10th, the Russians changed this war from a war of territory acquisition, buffers from NATO, and so on, and it became plain and simple a war of terror. And that's the reason that the Russians are going after the electrical power grids, the fuel supply lines, et cetera. And we're now coming into winter, and millions upon millions of Ukrainians are going to try to live in bombed-out houses and apartments. We saw many of these children and families already in the middle of October who are terrified about what's coming. And I think it's worth reminding our diplomats, our negotiators, that in addition to the military supplies, Ukraine, to survive the winter, is going to need a massive amount of wood-burning stoves, of backup generators, of winter clothes for children. We've been delivering quite a number of winter boots, for example, for children. But I am really fearful as a public health matter that this war of terror is going to wreak havoc. You know, the Russians responded to the blowing of the Crimea Russian bridge at one time, which was October 10th. And then a couple of days ago, once they were pushed out of Kherson, they responded with an increasing terrification of what's happening in that country. It is a tragedy, but we can't forget the humanitarian needs.
Dr. Redlener, Ambassador Daalder, Dan DeLuce, thank you all so much. We appreciate you sitting through the news conference with us and sharing your expertise.